The night was quiet, almost peaceful, until a single moment turned it into something terrifying. He was just walking home, minding his own life, but in the darkness, unseen eyes were already watching him, judging him, deciding a story about him that wasn't true. A car slowed beside him. A shadow followed. The air grew heavy with a danger he could feel but couldn't see. And with every step, he was unknowingly walking toward a moment that would change his life forever. But just when he thought the danger had passed, something far worse was waiting ahead. Before the truth unfolds, make sure you subscribe, so stories like this are never silenced. He kept walking step by step, the sound of his shoes brushing against the cracked pavement echoing softly through the quiet street. The night wrapped around him like something delicate, something that could break without warning. This was the same path he had walked his whole life, the worn sidewalk, the leaning fences, the old streetlights buzzing faintly above, yet tonight everything felt different. The air felt heavier, colder, as if something unseen was watching from just beyond the edge of his sight. He adjusted the strap of his worn bag and tried to tell himself it was nothing. Just another evening, just another walk home, nothing more than that. But deep inside, a quiet instinct whispered caution, the kind of instinct that comes from experience, from moments that taught him comfort is never guaranteed. The houses around him stood silent, windows glowing faintly like distant eyes in the dark, the world pretending to sleep while his awareness slowly sharpened with every step he took. He thought of home, the small kitchen light he always left on, the quiet room waiting for him, the simple peace he hoped to return to, and for a brief moment that thought steadied his breath. But then the sound returned. Footsteps. Slow, careful, moving when he moved, matching his pace as if they belonged to his shadow instead of another person. They didn't fade away. They didn't pass by. They stayed. His heartbeat grew heavier, not because he was tired, but because instinct knew what his mind didn't want to accept. He didn't turn around. Not yet. He knew how easily a single movement could change everything. So he kept walking, calm on the outside, a quiet storm on the inside, every step measured, every breath controlled. And as the faint hum of an engine crept forward behind him, and unseen eyes continued to watch, he realized something he had felt many times before, that this moment wasn't unexpected. It was familiar. A shadow that had followed him through different streets, different days, reminding him that safety was never promised, only hoped for. He walked a little farther, his steps steady but cautious, and as he moved beneath the dim glow of the streetlights, the world around him began to feel stretched thin, like the night itself was watching every movement he made. The headlights behind him grew brighter, sliding across the pavement and pulling his shadow long across the cracked road, turning his silhouette into something fragile, distant, almost disconnected from his own body. It reminded him how small a person can feel when they are being watched, how even the shape of someone's existence can change when authority lingers too close. The engine behind him kept moving at the same slow pace, never rushing forward, never falling back, just hovering at the edge of his awareness, like a quiet decision waiting to be made but never spoken aloud. The air felt colder now, and even the breeze across his face no longer felt natural. It felt deliberate, as if the world itself had paused just to see what would happen next. He tried to steady his breathing, reminding himself once again that he was doing nothing wrong. He was only walking home, only existing in a space where he had every right to be. Yet the feeling in his chest tightened slowly, wrapping around his thoughts like a knot that refused to loosen. He remembered other moments like this, moments where glances lasted too long, where silence felt heavier than words, where presence alone became suspicion. And tonight, under the faint streetlights, that feeling didn't come as a memory. It returned as reality, unfolding step by step. His shadow stretched farther as the car slowed behind him, every movement of his body outlined in light as if his existence was being examined from a distance. His heartbeat echoed in his ears, falling in rhythm with his footsteps, each sound reminding him that he was not alone, that he was being watched, assessed, judged without explanation. He resisted the urge to look back too quickly. He knew how moments like this could change in an instant, how fear could be misunderstood, how even the smallest motion could be taken as something it was never meant to be. So he kept moving with careful control, each step deliberate, every motion calm, every breath held steady, trying to hold onto his composure even as uncertainty closed in around him. The street felt wider, quieter, emptier, as if every part of the night existed only to frame this one fragile moment. And deep inside, he understood what his instincts had already decided. This wasn't coincidence anymore. He finally allowed himself to slow his pace, not stopping completely, just enough to listen more closely, to let the sounds behind him speak for themselves. The footsteps returned, steady, deliberate, never rushed, and with each quiet impact against the pavement, the truth settled deeper into his awareness. He was being followed, not spoken to, not approached, just followed silently, intentionally, like a presence that existed only to shadow his every step. His shoulders tightened, a faint tension spreading across his back as instinct reminded him to stay controlled, to hold his composure, to resist the urge to react too quickly. He had lived through moments like this before, moments where presence turned into scrutiny, where silence became judgment, where simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time became reason enough to be watched. And now, that same familiar weight returned, pressing slowly into his chest like a memory he never asked to carry. Behind him, the engine rolled to a stop, its soft hum hanging in the air like an unfinished sentence that no one was willing to speak. But the footsteps didn't stop. They kept their rhythm, measured, intentional, each one feeling like a choice rather than movement. He didn't need to see who was there to understand what the moment meant. The energy in the air already told the story. He thought about how easily suspicion attaches itself to a person, how identity alone can become a reason to be questioned or confronted long before truth is ever known. The night around him seemed to close in, not with noise but with tension, a quiet pressure that waited at the edge of every second, ready to break with the smallest misunderstanding. He breathed slowly, steadying himself, keeping fear behind patience, reminding his body to remain calm even when uncertainty wrapped itself around every breath. He told himself again that he was doing nothing wrong. He was simply walking home. Yet somehow, even that simple truth felt fragile now, as if it could be taken away without warning. His steps stayed careful, controlled, intentional, moving forward while unease followed just a few strides behind, like a shadow that refused to fade. And as the realization settled not as shock, but as confirmation of something his instincts already knew, he understood that this moment was no accident. The presence behind him wasn't passing by. It had chosen to remain. And with every step he took down that quiet, dimly lit street, one thought grew clearer inside him. This was no longer just a walk home. This was a moment he would now have to survive. He didn't turn around right away. Instead, he let the silence deepen, letting the moment shape itself while every breath gathered slowly in his chest. The pale glow of a streetlight brushed across his face, tracing the tension in his eyes, the quiet, controlled fear he had learned to carry through so many moments like this before. His jaw tightened slightly, not out of anger, but out of restraint, the kind of restraint that comes from experience, from understanding just how fragile safety can become when assumptions enter a moment uninvited. He held his posture steady, every movement deliberate, careful, intentional, nothing sudden, nothing that could be misunderstood, nothing that might turn uncertainty into danger. The night around him felt still again, but it wasn't the stillness of peace. It was the stillness of anticipation, a silence heavy with meaning, as if the world itself was waiting to see what would happen next. His thoughts drifted through memories. He never wanted to relive rooms that went quiet when he walked in, eyes that followed him longer than they should. Moments where he felt like a stranger in places that were supposed to belong to him. He swallowed gently, grounding himself, reminding his body to stay calm even while fear pressed quietly beneath the surface. He had learned long ago that reacting too openly, too quickly, could turn misunderstanding into consequence. So he breathed slowly, his hands resting naturally at his sides, his expression composed yet guarded, every part of him balancing between dignity and caution. The faint sounds of the city faded into the background, as if everything around him narrowed into this one fragile encounter, this single, uncertain moment suspended in the middle of the night. His thoughts didn't rush. They focused. He became aware of every step, every breath, every choice he made, fully conscious of how easily things could shift without warning. He understood the risks that were never spoken aloud, the kind that lived not in actions, but in perception. And yet beneath the fear, there was also strength, a quiet resilience shaped by every time he had been seen not as a person, but as a possibility someone else had imagined. The light above flickered for a brief second, and it felt as though even the world hesitated with him, caught in the same uncertain pause. Still, he remained calm on the outside, steady and composed, even as uncertainty lingered in his chest, reminding him that whatever was unfolding behind him wasn't coincidence. It was deliberate, and whatever came next would matter. Then, cutting through the silence like a sharp edge in the dark, a voice finally spoke, firm, steady, unmistakably commanding. It didn't sound curious, and it didn't sound uncertain. It carried a tone that felt already decided, as if judgment had arrived before truth was ever given a chance to exist. In that single moment, the air around him tightened, and the night no longer felt open. It felt enclosed, controlled, defined by authority rather than understanding. He stood very still, every movement measured with careful precision, knowing how easily a moment like this could change with even the slightest misstep. He lifted his hands slightly, not out of surrender, but out of survival, a quiet gesture shaped by experience, by lessons passed down through years of navigating moments that never should have existed in the first place. His heart beat steadily beneath his calm exterior, every rhythm echoing with the awareness that every motion he made would now be watched, interpreted, turned into meaning he might never be allowed to explain. He spoke softly, his voice controlled and respectful, each word chosen with care as he explained who he was, where he was going, why he was there, not to justify his existence, but simply to be seen as human in a moment where humanity already felt distant. Yet as the words left his lips, he could feel them drift into the air and disappear, as if the truth had no weight here, no place, no audience willing to receive it. The silence that followed felt colder than the night itself, a silence that didn't hold understanding but distance, the kind of distance that separates identity from perception, reality from assumption. His hands remained steady, his posture stayed controlled, every breath stayed measured as he balanced himself between caution and dignity, standing in a space where even calmness carried risk. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't argue, he didn't let fear turn into anger, because he knew that in moments like this, reactions could take on meanings he never intended, consequences he did not deserve. The presence before him remained firm, unwavering, its authority unbending, its judgment unspoken but deeply felt. And in that quiet exchange, he understood something painful and undeniable, that this moment was not about truth, it was about perception. The tension in the air deepened, pressing against him like a weight he could not move. The night remained silent, yet the silence spoke louder than anything that could have been said. And as he stood there, suspended between who he truly was and who he was being imagined to be, one realization settled inside him with absolute clarity. This encounter was only beginning, and whatever came next would decide far more than the outcome of a single night. The moment stretched as new movement entered the space around him, and he could feel the shift without even needing to look. Presence multiplied, attention tightened. The night seemed to close in just a little more than before. Another figure approached, footsteps deliberate and precise, each one landing on the pavement like a decision being marked into the ground. The soft glow of the streetlights brushed across dark uniforms, forming quiet silhouettes that positioned themselves around him, not aggressive, but firm, controlled, leaving no doubt about who now commanded the space. He stood still, posture reserved, breathing steady, fully aware of how quickly the world could shrink in moments like this. How a wide, open street could suddenly become a small circle where every gesture, every motion, every word carried consequence. The patrol car lights flickered faintly, casting muted colors across the road, creating a sharp contrast between the emptiness of the night and the authority surrounding him. An invisible boundary formed. The distance tightened. The street no longer felt open. It felt contained, as if the night itself had stepped aside and allowed this encounter to become the center of everything. His heart stayed steady, not because he felt safe, but because he knew that safety depended on remaining composed, disciplined, quietly controlled beneath the weight of scrutiny. He thought of all the times he had seen moments like this from afar, in stories, in memories, in conversations whispered by others who had lived through the same kind of quiet pressure. And now, standing here in the middle of the street, he understood that heaviness more clearly than ever before. Another question came. He answered calmly, patiently, carefully, even though he could feel how little his words truly changed anything. The silence between the responses felt louder than the voices themselves, filled with assumptions never spoken aloud, but deeply present. He stayed aware of everything: the cold air on his skin, the distant creak of old houses, the stillness layered across the neighborhood, yet no matter how far his senses stretched, the moment kept pulling him back into this small, tense circle. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel shock. What he felt was a deep, exhausted awareness, the recognition of a pattern he had seen too many times before, a pattern that didn't arrive through chaos but through control, through quiet pressure, through presence that left no room for who he truly was to be seen. And as he stood there, surrounded not by force but by tension, he understood something painful. Danger does not always come through violence. Sometimes it comes through silence. The silence deepened again, settling over the street like a weight that refused to lift. He could feel it pressing against his chest, not crushing him, but reminding him just how fragile the boundary was between calm and escalation. The figures around him remained still, their faces unreadable beneath the faint streetlight, their movements minimal, as if the entire moment existed in a careful balance that could shift with the smallest misunderstanding. He lowered his gaze slightly, not from defeat, but from caution, knowing how easily confidence could be misread, how quickly composure could be mistaken for defiance. His breathing moved slowly through his lungs, each inhale controlled, each exhale deliberate, the rhythm becoming the only steady sound in a moment where everything else felt frozen in stillness. The night felt colder now, not in temperature but in atmosphere, as though warmth itself had stepped aside to make room for tension. He could sense eyes on him, watching, evaluating, waiting. And with that awareness came a heavy truth. He no longer existed here as a man walking down a street. He existed as a moment someone else believed they had the right to define. For a brief second, he wished the silence could dissolve, that understanding could replace suspicion, that trust could exist where doubt had settled. But he also knew hope alone could not change the reality he was standing in. The voices that had spoken earlier now rested in stillness, and the pause between words stretched thin, fragile, as if even the night itself was bracing for whatever might come next. He remembered other silences, ones he had lived through before, the kind that came just before decisions were made without listening, the kind that existed right before conclusions formed without truth. Those memories did not overwhelm him. They grounded him. They reminded him that survival in moments like this depended on patience, on restraint, on staying steady even when fear pressed close. His thoughts did not wander. They stayed here in this second, fully aware that every breath mattered, that even silence carried meaning, that stillness itself could be dangerous. The street felt impossibly quiet, the world narrowing into a small space between breath and uncertainty, between control and vulnerability. And in that fragile stretch of silence, as time hovered without moving forward, he understood something clearly. The next moment would not come from chaos, it would come from this stillness. A faint breeze moved across the street, carrying the cold scent of asphalt through the night air, and as it brushed against his skin, he became sharply aware of how thin the ground beneath him felt. The invisible line between safety and danger, a line that could tilt without warning. His frayed shoulder bag rested lightly at his side, brushing his leg with each small shift of movement, a quiet reminder of the simple life he had been living only moments earlier. The walk home, the routine, the peace that now felt distant, replaced by uncertainty. He stood carefully, posture steady, hands relaxed but visible, every part of his body speaking caution even when his voice remained calm. He sensed the figures stepping slightly closer, not with aggression, but with authority, closing distance instead of bridging it. And that single, subtle shift sent another ripple of tension through the night. He knew this was the point where moments changed, where misunderstanding could become consequence, where perception could outweigh truth. His thoughts trembled beneath his calm expression, not from panic, but from awareness. Awareness of history, of experience, of the knowledge that people like him had stood in moments like this before, and had not always been allowed to walk away. The night no longer felt open. It felt edged narrow, enclosing, as if everything around him had reshaped into a boundary he could not cross. His breathing stayed controlled, his shoulders steady, his eyes lowered not in fear but with intent, because control was the only safety he had left in a moment that did not belong to him. He did not speak unless spoken to. He did not move unless instructed. He existed carefully, deliberately, as though every second required negotiation with the weight surrounding him. The figures across from him remained firm, their presence quiet but commanding, and within that tense space lay an unspoken truth. His humanity was no longer assumed. It was being questioned. The pavement beneath his feet felt solid, yet fragile, like ground that might shift if misunderstood. And as he stood there, balanced between dignity and caution, between identity and perception, he knew this moment had become a threshold, a moment that would decide whether the night would pass quietly or change his life forever. He lifted his hands a little higher, just enough to show openness without surrender, the movement slow, careful, deliberate. It wasn't fear that shaped the gesture, it was survival, the silent understanding that calmness could protect him in ways words never could. His fingers hovered gently in the cool night air, not clenched, not rigid, held in a fragile space between restraint and vulnerability. It was a language he had learned long before this night, the language of caution in the presence of authority. His heart beat steadily beneath his composed expression, the rhythm quiet but unmistakable, echoing through his chest as he reminded himself that every movement mattered. He could feel eyes on him, reading every gesture, every breath, as if his body itself had become something to be interpreted and measured. He spoke again, voice soft and controlled, his words respectful and carefully chosen, offering explanation not because he was guilty, but because experience had taught him that explanations were expected from him long before understanding was ever offered in return. And when silence followed, it did not comfort him. It lingered heavy, unresolved, as though his truth had been spoken into a space that had already decided not to receive it. His shoulders remained still, tension hidden beneath restraint. Yet inside, he felt a quiet exhaustion, not from this moment alone, but from the many moments before it, from a lifetime of moving through spaces where his presence alone became reason enough to be cautious. He wished quietly that trust could exist here, that humanity could be seen without needing to be proven. But he also knew hope could not rewrite reality. The figures before him remained firm, their expressions unreadable, their authority unwavering. And in that imbalance lived another truth. The responsibility to remain calm rested entirely on him, while the power to define the moment rested elsewhere. His hands stayed lifted, hovering gently in the cold air, not as surrender, but as a quiet shield, a fragile form of self-protection shaped by experience. And as he stood there, caught between silence and explanation, between fear and restraint. He understood that survival in this moment meant holding himself steady, even when the world refused to see how hard he was fighting just to remain unharmed. He tried once more to explain himself, his words slow, careful, shaped with patience, carrying nothing more than the simple truth that he was only walking home. But even as he spoke, he could feel how little those words mattered beneath the weight of the moment. The figure before him did not respond with understanding, he responded with posture, rigid, unyielding, authority spoken through stillness rather than voice. This didn't feel like conversation, it felt like judgment delivered without accusation, a verdict shaped before truth could exist. His voice remained steady, but beneath that calm tone lived a quiet ache, the ache of being misunderstood in a way that was not new but painfully familiar. He watched the controlled edge of movement, the fixed stance, the measured expressions, and he understood that nothing happening here belonged to chance. Everything existed inside intention. The air grew heavier once more. The silence thickened around him, pressing softly against his breath, reminding him that he was standing in a space where truth did not determine outcome, interpretation did. He did not plead. He did not argue. He did not challenge. Because he knew that resistance wasn't measured only by action. Sometimes it was measured by the tone of a breath, the angle of a gesture, the slightest misreading of fear. He remained composed, held together by discipline, by experience, even as the realization deepened inside him. His safety, his dignity, his very existence was being weighed in a moment he never asked to be part of. The night around them stayed still, but the stillness no longer felt empty. It felt crowded with meaning, with tension, with the quiet knowledge that something was shifting beyond his control. And as his words faded into the cold air, unheard, unreceived, he understood that he was not simply explaining who he was. He was defending the right to exist without being seen as a threat, a right that should have belonged to him freely, yet now felt painfully fragile beneath the shadow of authority. The space around him felt as though it was shrinking not through force, but through proximity, as the figures shifted slightly closer, narrowing the distance in a way that felt deliberate, controlled, unspoken. He could feel the pressure closing in, not like a hand pressing against his body, but like an invisible field surrounding him, tightening the moment into something he could no longer step away from. The street that once felt open now seemed confined, the air thick with expectation, the night growing quieter, as if every sound beyond this small circle had chosen to disappear. He stood still, steady, composed, every inch of his posture carrying the quiet strength of someone who understood how fragile control could be inside a space he did not command. His eyes stayed lowered, his hands hovered in careful restraint, his breath remained measured, his thoughts anchored in caution, because he knew the difference between safety and danger could depend on how still he remained, how calm he appeared, how little fear he allowed to show. He felt smaller inside the frame of the moment, not because he lacked strength, but because the environment around him had been shaped to make him feel small, to remind him that power here did not live in truth or dignity, it lived in presence. The faint reflections of light across the uniforms only reinforced that reality, each shimmer symbolizing something larger than any single person, larger than any word he could speak. He thought about how often the world measured people before it ever tried to understand them, how often identity was treated as justification instead of humanity. He did not resent the silence, he recognized it, because silence was the part of moments like this that spoke the loudest, revealing everything that was felt, but never acknowledged. His heart remained calm, not because the situation was safe, but because calmness was the only thing he could control when everything else around him existed outside his power. The circle tightened further, slowly, methodically, until movement no longer felt like a choice, but a risk. And as he stood there, aware of every inch of space being taken from him one breath at a time, he understood something painful. This was not tension born from chaos. This was tension built through structure, through authority, through quiet pressure that made one truth unmistakable: whether or not he had done anything wrong no longer mattered. The moment had already decided that he needed to be contained. The air shifted again, subtle but undeniable, as if even the night understood that something inside the moment had changed. Observation was becoming action. Uncertainty was becoming decision. One of the figures stepped forward, not fast, but with intent, every movement quiet, controlled, carrying the weight of authority, crossing the line from watching to intervening. The gesture was small, but its meaning was enormous. The encounter was no longer suspended in silence. It was moving now, moving somewhere he had no power to direct. He felt that shift settle inside his chest, not as panic, but as recognition. Recognition of a pattern he had seen before, in stories, in memories, in histories he never asked to inherit, yet somehow still carried. His body remained still, every muscle controlled, every breath careful, his restraint not born from submission, but from the will to survive a moment that no longer cared who he truly was. He could feel the distance widening between intent and perception, as if his humanity had been pushed aside to make room for assumption. The voice that spoke again carried sharper command, not loud, but final, leaving no room for questions, no room for conversation, no room for understanding. His reply, when it came, was gentle, patient, deliberate, yet it felt like his words dissolved before they ever reached the space between them. The tension settling into his shoulders was not anger, it was sorrow. The sorrow of feeling unseen, while his existence was being defined without him. The world tilted slightly as authority stepped closer, as presence became pressure, as the night leaned toward something irreversible. And in that fragile heartbeat he knew the balance had shifted. The encounter had crossed from uncertainty into inevitability. Whatever came next would not arrive slowly. It would arrive with weight, with finality, with consequence. And as he stood suspended in that turning point, one thought lingered painfully inside him, not fear of what was happening, but grief for the truth that moments like this were never isolated. They were part of something much larger than him. It happened suddenly, faster than breath, faster than thought. A burst of motion cut through the stillness as force met body, and control slipped away from him in a moment he could neither stop nor escape. Hands moved toward him, firm, unyielding, decisive, and before he could steady himself, the world tilted sharply and the ground rushed upward. The pavement struck him hard, cold, rough, unrelenting, scraping into his skin as his body hit the earth, the sound echoing through the empty street like the final line of a sentence he had never chosen to speak. The air burst from his lungs in a trembling breath, fear and pain colliding inside him, not only in flesh, but somewhere deeper, somewhere human, where humiliation and shock lived side by side. His frayed shoulder bag slid across the road, dragging beside him as his body settled against the cold surface. The night blurred into flickers of sound, overlapping voices, shifting footsteps, everything distant and close all at once. He tried to breathe slowly, carefully, but every inhale felt thin and fragile, as if the air itself resisted entering his chest. He no longer existed as a man standing. He existed as a body on the pavement, a position he had never imagined for himself, yet one he knew existed far too often in stories like his. The pain was not only physical, it carried a deeper ache, a silent wound to dignity, a quiet devastation echoing every life that had been forced into this same posture, under this same weight, beneath this same assumption. He did not shout, he did not fight, he did not resist, because even now, especially now, survival depended on restraint, on stillness, on accepting the ground beneath him until the moment finally allowed him to rise. And as he lay there, the pavement cold against his skin, he understood something with heartbreaking clarity. This was no longer just an encounter. It had become an imprint, one his body would remember long after the night was gone. He remained there in the quiet aftermath of impact, his breath trembling in small, uneven waves as he tried to steady the rhythm inside his chest. The world felt distant, yet painfully close, every sound amplified, every motion magnified, as if time itself had slowed just enough for him to feel every second passing over him. His eyes widened not with panic but with shock, the cold pavement beneath his face reminding him with every breath that he was no longer standing, that his balance, his stability, his dignity had been stripped away. The night air felt colder from the ground, pressing against him like a weight he could not push away. Every inhale carrying the sharp edge of fear he struggled to contain. He sensed figures above him, hovering, rigid, unwavering. Their authority felt even more powerful from where he lay. He focused on breathing, slow if he could, steady if his lungs allowed it, because breath was the only thing he still controlled. His thoughts drifted softly through memories, warnings, lessons, quiet fears, all gathering into this one moment he now lived inside. He did not cry out. He did not plead. He stayed still, not because stillness meant acceptance, but because stillness meant survival. The pavement scraped against his skin with each tiny movement, reminding him that pain was no longer just something he felt. It had become something he was forced to endure. The silence between voices felt heavier than any sound, carrying the unspoken truth that this moment was not seen as tragedy. It was seen as procedure. And as he lay there, breath shallow, fear contained, heart aching beneath composure, he understood something deeply. Helplessness does not always come from chaos. Sometimes it comes from cold air, rigid posture, and the quiet decision that the world will not hear you. Yet even beneath that weight, somewhere inside him, a small strength remained. Fragile, quiet, but alive. Time stretched into a long, heavy stillness, the world narrowing to the small space between his body and the pavement. He remained frozen in fear, not the kind that screams or thrashes, but the kind that holds itself inward, silent, controlled, pressing against the chest like a weight too heavy to speak aloud. The dim streetlight cast a faint glow across the scene, shadows stretching along the ground and outlining the shape of his body, small, vulnerable, exposed beneath the presence standing above him. The moment did not move forward, and it did not release. It hovered, suspended in tension the night refused to break. A slow ache spread through his limbs, not sharp, but deep. A quiet echo of impact that reminded him how quickly dignity could be taken without a word ever being spoken. The figures beside him stood firm, posture rigid, authority unshaken, their silence speaking louder than anything they could have said. The world around them felt empty, yet full of meaning, full of imbalance, full of the unspoken truth that he now existed only inside the narrative others had chosen for him. He did not lift his head. He did not move his hands. He did not risk more than breath, because here, fear could not express itself through reaction. Here, fear had to become stillness. What hurt most was not the cold ground beneath him. It was the knowledge that his humanity had been overshadowed by suspicion, that he had been turned into something he was not, without ever being allowed to be seen. The night felt endless, every second echoing with the awareness that this moment existed far beyond physical pain. It existed inside history, inside memory, inside countless moments just like this. And as he remained there, frozen not by shock but by survival, one truth settled deep inside him. This moment would not leave with the night. It would follow him. It would live inside him. A reminder that even when he was simply walking home, the world still had the power to decide whether he belonged on his feet or on the ground. The pressure around him finally began to loosen, not in a sudden rush of relief, but in a slow, uncertain unwinding, as if the night itself were reluctantly unclenching its grip. The voices around him faded into distant sound, the movements lost their rigid edge, and the air slowly stretched open again, giving space back to the world one fragile inch at a time. He stayed still for a moment longer, unsure whether this change meant safety or only a pause, unsure whether the fading tension was real or temporary. His breath trembled as he gathered himself, every motion careful, deliberate, cautious, the way someone moves after surviving something that might return without warning. He rose slowly, not with confidence, but with quiet restraint, his body aching, his spirit worn, every muscle carrying the memory of the ground that had held him moments earlier. The night felt different now, not calmer, but heavier, as if the darkness remembered everything that had happened and refused to let it vanish into silence. He did not speak. He did not question. He did not ask for answers he knew would never truly be given. He simply stood there, silent and steady, carrying the humiliation still lingering in his chest, the vulnerability still wrapped around his breath. The world around him began to move again, slow footsteps, shifting posture, motion returning to a space that had been locked in tension. But inside him, time had not yet begun to move forward. His dignity felt bruised. His spirit felt marked in ways no one else could see, the kind of wound that does not bleed, but still hurts just as deeply. Standing there in the uneasy quiet, he understood that the moment was ending not because truth had surfaced, but because power had chosen to release him. And that realization cut deeper than any command, any word, any gesture that came before it. The street returned to stillness. The night returned to silence, but nothing about the world felt ordinary anymore. He knew now that moments like this do not fade when they're over. They remain inside the body, inside the mind, inside the quiet corners where memory lives long after sound has disappeared. And as he took his first slow breath as someone allowed to stand again, one truth settled painfully inside him. Tonight, survival did not feel like victory. It felt like something he had barely been permitted to keep. He turned and began to walk, each step carrying the echo of everything he had just endured, every movement heavy, with a silence that spoke louder than any words he could say. The street stretched ahead of him, long, dim, familiar, yet it no longer felt like the path he had always known. It felt like a corridor he was leaving behind, carrying a weight he could not set down. His shoulders rested low, not in defeat, but in exhaustion, the exhaustion of someone who had carried himself carefully through a moment where even breathing felt like risk. The patrol car faded behind him, shrinking into distance, yet its shadow remained inside his thoughts, refusing to disappear with space or distance. He did not look back. He didn't need to. The memory would follow him whether his eyes returned to it or not. The rhythm of his footsteps felt different, slower, heavier, shaped by something deeper than fatigue. Every step reminded him that he was walking away not because understanding had been reached, but because permission had been granted. The night wind brushed gently across his face, and for the first time since it began, the world around him felt open again, but openness no longer meant freedom. Now, openness meant exposure, vulnerability, the awareness that this could happen again without warning. The silence around him did not comfort him, it echoed. It echoed in the space between his heartbeat and his thoughts, in the quiet ache in his chest, in the faint tremor that still lingered in his hands. He walked forward as a man who was still here, still alive, yet carrying the invisible weight of something that had reached deep into his spirit and left its mark. The street behind him faded, but the memory did not. The night continued, but he was no longer the same man who had entered it. And as he moved forward through the dim light, one truth stayed with him. Some moments do not end when the world moves on. They continue, living inside the heart of the one who had to survive them. When he finally reached his door, his hands trembled against the handle, the simple act of arriving feeling heavier than any distance he had walked. He paused there for a moment, standing between the world outside that had nearly erased him, and the small space inside that still felt like refuge, a fragile threshold where safety and memory collided. When he stepped inside, the room looked unchanged, warm lamplight, familiar shadows, quiet stillness waiting patiently. Yet he knew the man who crossed that doorway was not the same one who had left it earlier that night. He sat slowly at the table, as if his body might break if he moved too quickly, his hands resting in front of him, still trembling, not from motion, but from memory. The silence in the room didn't feel peaceful, it felt heavy, thick, filled with echoes of voices, commands, and the sharp cold of pavement still lingering beneath his skin. He closed his eyes, and the night returned in fragments. Headlights stretching his shadow, footsteps behind him, pressure closing in, the world tilting and placing him on the ground. The images did not feel distant, they felt close, alive, pulsing behind his eyelids with every breath. His chest tightened as he tried to steady his breathing, but the air felt dense, unwilling, carrying the remnants of fear his body had not yet released. His tears did not fall loudly. They came quietly, gently, like grief that had waited too long to be acknowledged. He was not crying only for himself. He was crying for every story that lived inside moments like his, stories whispered in fear, remembered in silence, carried across generations as warnings rather than memories. The room stayed still, but inside him, emotion moved like a storm, soft, controlled, undeniable. And he understood that what he had lived through was not just an incident. It was a wound that would live inside him long after this night was gone, shaping how he breathed, how he walked, how he existed in spaces where suspicion arrived before his name ever did. Days passed, yet the memory refused to loosen its hold. It lingered in small moments of his routine, in the way his heart tightened when footsteps sounded behind him, in the way the night now felt different, heavier, unfamiliar. Streets he once walked without thought now carried shadows that followed him long after daylight returned. He moved through the world with sharpened awareness, not born from imagination, but from experience, the experience of knowing how quickly a peaceful evening could turn into something fragile and dangerous. Reflections of city lights in a window reminded him of the streetlight that hovered above him that night, its faint glow etched permanently into memory. Sometimes he stood at the window, staring into the quiet darkness, not in fear, but in reflection, in acceptance of a truth he had never wanted to face so closely. The memory did not shout inside him, it spoke softly, steadily, in the language of lived reality. He began to see that what happened to him was not isolated. It echoed through headlines, conversations, names spoken with grief and love. His experience had become part of a larger pattern, one that stretched across lives, across years, across countless untold stories. The realization hurt, not because he was alone, but because he wasn't. He did not let bitterness grow. Instead, something more human took root, a quiet determination, a reflective strength, a refusal to pretend the moment had vanished simply because time insisted he move forward. The memory remained, not only as a wound, but as a truth he would no longer allow the world to dismiss. With time, the weight of the moment did not disappear, but it changed. It did not fade into silence. It reshaped itself into resilience, into a quiet strength living inside him, steady and enduring. One morning, beneath soft light, he stood still for a moment and realized something powerful. Despite everything, he was still here, still breathing, still walking, still moving forward in a world that once tried to reduce him to fear. His reflection in the glass did not show a man untouched by pain, it showed a man who had survived it, a man who carried memory not as weakness, but as truth. The past did not vanish, it became part of his voice, part of his understanding, part of the empathy carved deeper into his heart. He knew now that his story did not belong to one night alone. It belonged to a broader struggle for dignity, for recognition, for the right to exist without being defined by suspicion. He did not see himself as broken. He saw himself as someone who endured what should never have been asked of him and still remained standing. The memory of pressure and fear did not erase his humanity. It strengthened his resolve to hold on to it. He walked forward with quiet courage, not loud, not defiant, but steady, grounded in survival. His life did not return to what it once was, but it did not end that night either. It continued with scars, with awareness, with truth, and with a strength no one could take from him. And as he moved on, he carried with him a question, not only for himself, but for the world, a question about justice, about empathy, about whether society would ever learn to see beyond fear and recognize the humanity in every life it touched. He did not yet know the answer, but even without it, he walked on. Because survival had become more than endurance, it had become a quiet declaration that he still existed and that his story still mattered.